Chapter 7. Suggestions adverse to health. It is axiomatic that the more beneficent a law is, the heavier are the penalties exacted for its violation. This is divine justice, and in the realm of natural law the rule is inexorable. Hence the highest conception of human justice in criminal jurisprudence is to make the punishment fit the crime. Owing, however, to human imperfections, the highest ideal is not often, if ever, reached. Although it is more and more nearly approximated as humanity rises in the scale of civilization, hence the gradual restriction of the death penalty to violations of the laws for the protection of human life. In nature's laws the inexorable rule is as above stated, and no amount of culture or experience or evolutionary development can enable one of God's creatures to evade the full penalty exacted by nature for the violation of one of her laws. Necessarily this is as true of the laws of life, mind, and health as it is of any other. If it were not, there could be no such thing as a science of psychology or of physiology or of therapeutics, for nothing could be safely predicated upon the truth of that most fundamental of all the axioms of science, the constancy of nature. In fact, one of the surest methods of definitely ascertaining and confirming the existence and universality of a supposed law of nature is by systematic observation of the evils resulting from its violation. This is especially true of the laws of health, as is shown by the fact that most of the important discoveries in therapeutical science were the results of observations of pathological conditions of the human body or of the mind. If the penalties are constant and uniform, coextensive with the real or supposed range or scope of the law itself, and commensurate in each case with the magnitude and character of the infractions, it is presumptive, if not conclusive, evidence of the existence of the law. To this test we must now submit the law of suggestion. If the axiom is true that the more beneficent a law is, the heavier are the penalties exacted for its violation, we shall have a right to expect to find that a perversion of the power of suggestion is followed by untold evils to body, mind, and soul. And this, as I shall attempt to show, is borne out by all human experience. For the present, however, I shall confine myself to the domain of therapeutics, although enough will be said to show that the principle applies with equal force to every field of human activity. Two questions have been asked by speculative philosophers of all the ages, neither of which could ever be satisfactorily answered prior to the discovery of the law of suggestion. The first is, why are the lower animals so much more healthy than the human race? The second is, why does man grow weaker as he grows wiser? Both these questions have been answered more or less satisfactorily from various standpoints, but it is now safe to say that the law of suggestion reveals the prime factor in the solution of both problems. In the first place, the lower animals, owing to their lack of intelligence, are entirely exempt from the influence of suggestions adverse to health. The same is true of idiots and of many insane persons, and for the same reason. In neither case can adverse suggestions reach the subjective mind, owing to the limited intelligence of the objective. Hence, nature, as the world loosely defines that mysterious energy within which keeps us alive, is left free and untrammeled to follow its natural trend, which is always toward health and the conservation of the vital forces. On the other hand, man, whose objective mind is capable of receiving and assimilating impressions from innumerable sources, is the constant prey of suggestions adverse to health, and the most significant feature of it is that the more numerous are the sources from which man receives his impressions, the greater are the dangers which beset his pathway through life. In other words, the history of the world shows that as the sources of information multiply, the diseases of mankind increase in number and prevalence, and this in spite of man's increased knowledge of medicine, sanitation, and hygiene. This fact alone points unmistakably to a psychological cause. And to those who have followed my remarks thus far, it will be obvious that popular ignorance of the law of suggestion is responsible. For if suggestion is a therapeutic agency as effective and universal as we have found it to be, it follows that suggestions adverse to health must be equally potent in the other direction. This view of the case will be confirmed if we find that suggestions adverse to health are as common and as prevalent and as virulent, so to speak, as the diseases themselves. That is to say, we may expect to find that the increase of such suggestions, and the facilities for imparting them to the public, are proportioned to the increase in the number of diseases which afflict mankind, and this, as a matter of fact, is precisely what we do find. beginning with the lower animals and idiots, neither of whom are capable of receiving either a therapeutic suggestion or one adverse to health, and ascending through all the grades of human intelligence, we find that this ratio prevails. It follows that as in these days books and newspapers furnish facilities greater than ever before existed for imparting suggestions to those who read them, we may expect to find that books and newspapers are the prime sources of the suggestions, good or bad, which dominate mankind of the present day. Now, it cannot be denied that the press, especially the newspaper, leads the van in the world's material and intellectual progress, but it is equally true that the newspaper, as a means of promoting or promulgating psychological knowledge, has thus far proved a dismal failure. This is not the fault of the newspaper, per se, but it arises from the fact that the average newspaperman shows the prevailing ignorance of the fundamental principles of psychology, especially of the new psychology. I shall not stop to dwell upon the fact that the new psychology, in the hands of ignorance, readily lends itself to the uses of newspaper sensationalism, for that is not the worst feature of the situation. It matters little that the newspaper has succeeded in frightening its readers into an insane prejudice against hypnotism. For popular prejudice against that psychological agency is not without its value in guarding the public against the possible evils of hypnotism in the hands of ignorance and charlatanism. But the case assumes a serious aspect when we consider the newspaper as an agency for the promulgation of suggestions adverse to public health, and the fact that it is done unintentionally and in ignorance of the law of suggestion serves but to enhance the gravity of the situation. The first and most obvious agency through which the newspaper assists in the promulgation of suggestions adverse to health is the patent medicine advertisement. Everybody is familiar with the patent medicine man's insidious ways, and with what preternatural cunning he insinuates ideas of ill health into the minds of his readers. If his medicine is not a panacea for all the ills that flesh is heir to, he usually selects some disease that is quite common, say, dyspepsia, or liver complaint, or kidney trouble, or impure blood, and then proceeds to tell us that all other diseases arise from the particular disease which he has selected for a base of operations. He then proceeds to dilate upon the fatal character of his selection, and usually appends a long list of symptoms by which anyone can know that he is a victim. The list is always extensive enough to include every conceivable sensation that is at all uncomfortable, so that few healthy persons escape, and none who are watchful for pathological symptoms in themselves can possibly count their cases outside of the fatal category. Fortunately for the patent medicine business, the latter class is very numerous. In fact, there are few persons who cannot, by persistent introspection, evoke any particular symptom that has been suggested. The tendency to do so is one of the serious difficulties encountered by the students of pathology in our medical colleges, and before the law of suggestion was understood by the faculties. Many students were compelled to abandon their studies because of their irresistible tendency to imagine, and eventually to experience, every symptom of the diseases they were called upon to study. Some, indeed, of the more persistent paid the penalty of death by diseases brought on by the suggestions borne in upon them by their studies. I personally know one physician, a graduate of a regular medical college, whose usefulness has often been seriously impaired in critical cases by the fact that he almost invariably took on the conditions of the patient while at the bedside, especially if the patient experienced any great amount of pain, cases of parturition forming no exception to the rule. Husbands have been known to suffer equally with their wives in such cases, and instances are not uncommon where the husband suffers all the pangs of morning sickness during the pregnancy of the wife. In one case, the husband was personally known to the author. His first experience occurred while he was temporarily absent from home, and it continued for 2 weeks before he returned. In the meantime, he consulted an eminent physician who happened to be familiar with the phenomenon, having met with several such cases in the course of his practice. He recognized the symptoms at once, but the fact of the absence of the husband from home when he was first attacked puzzled him, for telepathy was not then recognized as a possible factor in such cases by physicians of the old school. Nevertheless, the doctor was so sure of the significance of the symptoms that he urged a comparison of notes when the husband returned home. For, said he, what mysterious bond of psychological sympathy may exist between husband and wife? No one can tell. A comparison of experiences proved the correctness of the doctor's diagnosis, For the husband's and wife's sufferings were found to have been coincident as to time and character, day by day, from the beginning. This, however, is a slight digression. My object is to show how easily and powerfully suggestions may operate to bring about pathological conditions in people of far more than average intelligence. If medical students can be so wrought upon by the suggestions embraced in their general studies of pathology and their subsequent experiences at the bedside, what may we not expect of that large and constantly augmenting class whose knowledge of pathology is derived solely from the patent medicine advertisements in the daily papers? This question is especially pertinent in view of the fact that a very large proportion of that class are never so happy as when they can find in themselves an illustrative example of the pathological science to be found in the patent medicine advertisement. Suggestions arising from this source are, however, among the very least of the evils resulting from newspaper science of medicine. For, bad as are the influences of the patent medicine advertisement, it is not without its mitigating factors. In the first place, the medicines themselves are generally harmless, and in the second place they carry with them very potent suggestions as to their therapeutic efficacy. These are in the form of testimonials from those who have been raised from the dead by means of the nostrums advertised, and as such testimonials are usually very cheap and easy to procure. Especially from those who are fired with an ambition to see their names and pictures in print, or from decayed statesmen, they are generally abundant in quantity and of a quality exactly suited to the demands of trade. Many such testimonials are, no doubt, genuine, but be that as it may, they perform the functions of a therapeutic suggestion in reference to the remedy advertised, and thus elevate the patent medicine to the standard therapeutic value of the placebo of the regular practitioner. And this is saying a great deal for the patent medicine, for the average physician is never entitled to so much confidence as when he administers a placebo accompanied by a vigorous therapeutic suggestion. In the hands of the prudent physician, who is distrustful of his own diagnosis, the placebo is of the very essence of conservatism. It conceals the ignorance of the doctor, which is in itself a measure of great therapeutic value, and it supplies the patient's strenuous demand for medicine. It gives the physician time to study the case, and nature an opportunity to do his work for him. Best of all, it does no harm, and when accompanied by an intelligent therapeutic suggestion, it often does much good. To a limited extent, the harmless patent medicine, when accompanied by the testimonial, does the same thing in the same way. And hence the remark that the patent medicine advertisement is one of the least of the evils resulting from the medical literature of the newspaper. If I were called upon to name the most prolific source of suggestions adverse to health, I should unhesitatingly say that it is the newspaper literature relating to diet. It is safe to say that 9/10 of all diseases of the digestive organs, especially dyspepsia, are due primarily to the suggestions embraced in that kind of literature. The exasperating feature of it is that not one newspaper article in 100 on that topic is written by anyone who knows anything about the subject. They are generally written by boys or young ladies who are learning the trade of newspaper writers. Everybody familiar with that class of people is or that the highest ambition of the newspaper cub is to write something that will be extensively copied by other papers, and he soon learns that anything pertaining to health in general, or diet in particular, is sure of an extensive and eager hearing. Whereupon he proceeds to guess out a long list of articles of diet that are unhealthy because indigestible or innutritious or poisonous. In order to be entirely original and startling, he generally selects one or more of the most popular articles of diet in his community and tells his readers that they are perhaps slowly, but certainly surely, sapping the foundations of their respective constitutions by indulgence in this or that particular article of diet. One of the wise sayings of the celebrated Dr. Abernethy was that when a man begins seriously to dissect himself, he will soon be a fit subject for the undertaker. And this is precisely what the average reader of such articles generally proceeds to do. That is to say, the next time he indulges in the article of diet inveighed against, he proceeds to institute a series of introspective observations having special reference to the behavior of his stomach in presence of that particular article of nutriment, and he is generally rewarded by finding just what he is looking for, namely, some decidedly uneasy symptoms indicative of indigestion. The next time he tries it, the symptoms are more pronounced, and the third or fourth trial is generally sufficient to cause that particular dish, e.g. bread and butter, to be tabooed as utterly indigestible. Then he proceeds to lecture his family and friends on the subject of the insidious but deadly character of bread and butter, and in due time that article of food is banished from the household bill of fare. The next newspaper article attacks some other article of diet, and with the same result, and so on through the whole bill of fare of the ordinary household, the result being one or more confirmed dyspeptics in every family. It may be thought that I am stating an extreme case. It is extreme, but very common, for this is the way dyspeptics are created in 9 cases out of 10. The weakness of the stomach is often due solely to atrophy of that organ, and the atrophy is due, not to eating indigestible food, nor to habitual overtaxation of the digestive powers, but to the fact that it was not given enough to do to keep its powers at their maximum. It atrophies, precisely as any other organ of the body will atrophy, for the lack of a normal amount of exercise, and the only way to give it healthy exercise is to give it a normal amount of nutritious food to digest, always taking care to avoid those mental conditions which interfere with the normal action of the digestive organs. Strange as it may appear at first glance, the latter consideration is of the first importance, for there is no such thing in civilized countries as an indigestible article of human diet, provided the proper mental conditions are maintained. Conversely, there is no article of food that cannot be rendered indigestible by the induction of adverse mental conditions. The lesson is obvious and the remedy easy, but the discussion of it must be deferred for the moment. Another newspaper source of suggestions adverse to health is to be found in the tendency of the journalistic humorist to faddism in the construction of the so-called newspaper joke or humorous paragraph. A single illustration of my meaning will suffice. Many years ago, some preternaturally smart newspaper cub, an Englishman, I believe, conceived the idea of conquering fame by ridiculing the New England custom, then almost universal, of eating pie for dessert. The only thing connected with the custom, or the pie, that was a legitimate subject of raillery, even from an Englishman's dietetic standpoint, was the fact that the more luxurious of the New England pie-eaters indulged in that luxury 3 times a day. But the pie joke, feeble and harmless as it was in its infancy, survived and was passed around in its myriad forms, and so was the pie, until some more than ordinarily feeble-minded newspaper pathologist lifted up his voice and proclaimed the New England pie to be the real and only source of all the ills that American flesh was heir to. This, of course, was heralded far and wide as a great and an important scientific discovery in dietetics, and the usual process of introspection began in thousands of New England homes where pie had before been a benediction and a joy unspeakable 3 times a day, to say nothing of surreptitious pieces between meals. The usual results followed, and in an incredibly short space of time a cloud of witnesses arose to testify against pie. A careful watching of the symptoms revealed the fact that pie was utterly indigestible. In vain it was pointed out that for hundreds of years it had been eaten by all classes and under all conditions by New England people, and that no one had discovered that pie was other than wholesome as well as palatable and easily digested, until the newspaper fakir happened to think about it. Once started, the hue and cry went the rounds of the family journals, each one seeking to outdo all the others, until pie became such an abomination in the public mind that it required an abnormal development of nerve to defy popular opinion so far as to order a piece of pie at a public restaurant, and if anyone had the hardihood to do so, he was fortunate if he escaped a serious lecture by some neighboring reformer on the subject of the diabolical nature of pie. Even doctors were dragged into the crusade and compelled by force of public opinion to look wise and shake their heads when a convalescing patient craved a piece of pie. And Emerson was credited by a newspaper reporter with denouncing pie as the greatest evil with which the American nation had to contend. Some doctors even went so far as to claim the credit of the discovery that pie was indigestible, and others claimed to have always known that pie was the root of all evils in the American Commonwealth. To anyone familiar with the potency of suggestion, it will not seem strange that in the midst of such a crusade against a particular article of diet there should be found many whose experience amply justified the crusade. And when we reflect that in every newspaper-reading family in the United States the subject of the indigestibility of pie was a common topic of conversation at the table, it is not at all wonderful that in almost every family one or more should experience a fit of indigestion, after an indulgence followed by the inevitable introspection, or watching for the anticipated symptoms. It would indeed have been a miracle on a national scale if these results had not followed, and pie had not been tabooed, as a consequence, in many an otherwise well-regulated household. In point of fact, if the crusade had been started as an experiment, pure and simple, to test the efficacy of suggestion on a large scale, no better test could have been devised. For such an experiment, an absolutely wholesome, harmless, and easily digested article of diet would, for obvious reasons, furnish the crucial test of popular suggestibility. And I undertake to say that the American pie is as well adapted to the purpose as any food known to civilized mankind. In saying this, I do not include the article known as railroad pie, which is popularly believed, not without reason, to be so constructed as to render what is not sold to the famished traveler available as ballast in railroad construction. I refer to the American pie as it was made by our New England grandmothers in antebellum days, that is, before the crusade was instituted against it as an institution. Did any of the crusaders stop to analyze its contents with the view of ascertaining what it is that renders pie so very unwholesome? If so, the result has never been published. Let us, then, examine it dispassionately, with the view of determining, approximately, what proportion of suggestion has been mixed in with its other ingredients in order to render it indigestible. The American pie, per se, is built up of the following materials, to wit, flour, water, lard or butter, or both, sugar, and fruit, the latter normally predominating largely as to bulk. The more Epicurean taste prevailing among the aristocratic portion of New England farmers demanded a little flavoring of nutmeg, real nutmeg, not the nutmeg of Connecticut commerce, that being manufactured solely for the export trade. As tradition informs us, will some dietetic crank rise to inform us what there is among the materials themselves, or in the combination, that is unwholesome, or indigestible, or even hard to digest? Is it not, indeed, a combination devoutly to be wished for by anyone of simple taste and normal appetite? Is there anything connected with it, suggestion accepted, that could have the remotest tendency to cause it to disagree with the most delicate digestive apparatus? Clearly not. It is for this reason that I have employed the crusade against pie as an illustration of the fact that when once a suggestion adverse to any wholesome article of diet or drink is turned loose upon a community, it carries with it an incalculable amount of suffering among those who are ignorant of the subtle powers of suggestion. And I have spoken of the newspaper as the means by which such suggestions are most extensively promulgated, merely as an illustration of the remark made in a former chapter, that suggestions adverse to health are numerous in a community in proportion to its facilities for the promulgation and dissemination of intelligence. It follows that so long as man rests in ignorance of the law of suggestion, the higher the grade of his civilization, the more will he suffer from suggestions adverse to his health. If the New England pie was the only wholesome article of diet against which a crusade has been made, these words would not have been written. But the fact is, there is scarcely anything left for one to subsist upon if he pays attention to all the current, reform literature relating to diet. One by one, the most healthful and nutritious articles of food and drink have been laid under the ban, until now it would be impossible for a hungry man to indulge in a square meal without violating half a dozen or more of someone's dietetic rules and principles. And could such a man, after indulgence, be induced to peruse and assimilate the current literature on the subject of what he had been eating, he would be in imminent danger of a fit of indigestion that would last him a week, perhaps a lifetime. One book would tell him that the coffee with which he had prepared his stomach for the more solid foods was a deadly poison. Another would inform him that the beefsteak, or other meats, which constituted the piece de resistance of his meal, was the prime source of all the ills of the human stomach, to say nothing of its irresistible tendency to brutalize humanity and incite nations to war. The next authority would inhibit potatoes because they contain too much starch, and another would inhibit the other vegetables because they do not contain enough. One authority would tell him that he didn't eat enough salt with his food, and the next would be equally positive that salt in appreciable quantities is demoralizing to the human organism. One authority tells him that it is disastrous to drink anything during a meal, and the next dietetic savant tells him that he should deluge his stomach with hot water if he expects to eat anything with impunity. And so on through the whole bill of fare, be it great or small. I undertake to say that nothing that enters into the composition of the diet of civilized humanity has escaped denunciation by somebody, at some time, as being unfit for human food. Moreover, no such denunciation of any article of food has ever been unproductive of its legitimate results, namely, a cloud of witnesses in confirmation of the assertion. Do I hear someone say that bread, the staff of life / must be accepted from this wholesale statement? If anyone supposes that bread has escaped, he imagines a vain thing. A few years ago, an American lady, a brand new woman, was casting about for a mission in life. That is to say, she longed to reform somebody or something, it mattered not what. So long as it held out to her a prospect of standing at the head of a great movement. To that end, it must be something new, startling, original. She inclined to dietetics, not because she knew anything of the subject, but because she was not thus encumbered. In looking over the list of foods already under the ban of the reformer, she found nothing left but bread. It is true that bread had been foully dealt with by other iconoclasts, largely in the way of rendering it unpalatable and innutritious by making it principally of bran and other refuse material. But it was decidedly a new departure to denounce bread as the staff of death, and so she adopted that shibboleth as the keynote of her system of dietetic reform, and, for the want of anything else to live on which had not already been proven by her predecessors to be unwholesome, she advised mankind to live on nuts. Fortunately for the American people, they are endowed with a keen sense of the ridiculous, which decidedly limits the range of their suggestibility, and, consequently, the idea did not take, in this country, to a commercial extent. But the lady flew to England, organized a society of bread haters and nut eaters, started a magazine, and wrote a book, before John Bull began to laugh. It must not be supposed that the lady was entirely destitute of followers even in this country. On the contrary, many rose up to testify to the life-destroying potency of bread and the bland beneficence of nuts as an article of daily consumption at the family table. It will now be seen what a vast congeries of suggestions adverse to healthy American stomach is beset withal. I have spoken of the public press as being largely responsible primarily for this state of affairs. But when we reflect that what is said in books and newspapers is repeated over and over at every table at which a dietetic crank is allowed to feed, it will be seen that almost every family is more or less subjected to the infliction of such suggestions 3 times a day. Is it any wonder that we are known as a nation of dyspeptics? And is it not self-evident that heretofore cause and effect have been misplaced and misunderstood? Europeans tell us that our diet is unwholesome, and hence responsible for those ills which have come to be regarded as peculiarly American, and we are only too ready to echo the refrain. Whereas the fact is that in no nation on earth is the average table so bountifully supplied with good, plain, wholesome, and nutritious food as it is in the United States. It is a common saying that the average European cook could feed a family on what is wasted in an American family of the same size. Doubtless this is true, but it must not be forgotten that it must be a European family that could thus subsist. A normal American would starve to death on the same concoction of waste materials. No, the average American need not be ashamed or afraid of either his diet or his cuisine, for there is absolutely nothing unwholesome in the one, nor unscientific in the other. But he should avoid the current suggestions relating to both, as he would avoid famine or pestilence. For such suggestions as we have been considering will create a famine in the midst of abundance, and a pestilence amidst the most perfect physical environment. It is a literal fact that thousands of people in this country are perishing for the lack of proper nutriment, simply because they have allowed themselves to dwell upon the suggestions contained in current literature. Does anyone doubt the control of the mind over the vital processes? Who has not experienced a total suspension of the digestive functions upon the reception of bad news? Who has not experienced a sudden and total loss of appetite upon hearing certain disagreeable subjects discussed at the table? Who has not seen half the guests at a boarding house table suddenly disappear when the perennial idiot known as the boarding house wag provides himself beforehand with a long hair and pretends to pull it out of the hash? There are a few who can retain sausages on their stomachs, even the bologna, in the presence of the humorist who fancies that he has created an original joke by alluding to the possible constituent elements of the sausage of commerce. Fortunate indeed is the man who can hurl defiance at the joker by saying, "You can't turn my stomach / It not only indicates a healthy stomach, but the assertion itself constitutes an effective autosuggestion which fortifies the stomach against the adverse influence of the original suggestion of dog in the sausage. This leads us to the consideration of the sovereign remedy for all the manifold evils arising from the congeries of suggestions which we have been considering. Obviously, the remedy is autosuggestion, for if disease can be created by one suggestion, it follows that it can be cured by a counter-suggestion. The latter may be made by one person to another as by a mental healer to his patient, or it may be made by the patient himself, which is known as autosuggestion, other things being equal. An autosuggestion is more potent than a suggestion from any extraneous source, for the simple reason that an autosuggestion is generally backed by the objective convictions of the patient, whereas suggestions by another may directly contravene the patient's objective reason and experience, not that. The latter may not be effective when it is made with force and persistence, but that the former are more easily and naturally effective, either as a moral or a therapeutic agency. One may, therefore, counteract the great bulk of the current dietetic suggestions by the employment of just a little reason and common sense. If he feels that he must read what every crank has to say about diet and health, let him ask himself if there is any reasonable foundation for the diatribe against the particular article under treatment. And in 9 cases out of 10 he will find that it contravenes all reason and human experience. But the safest plan is to refrain from reading such stuff, for the tendency always is to try to verify what one reads on such subjects, especially if one is ignorant of the potency of suggestion and its tendency to create expected conditions. This is on the principle that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It is always easy to prevent an adverse suggestion from taking effect in the mind, and that is by not allowing it to find an entrance. To that end, one should never allow himself to think, much less talk, on the subject of the wholesomeness or digestibility of the food that is set before him. The good old biblical rule is the best: eat what is set before you, asking no questions for conscience' sake. Above all, having partaken of a dish, do not go away and sit down to watch for symptoms of indigestion. If one does that, he will be sure to find what he is seeking. The best rule of diet is to eat what you like to eat, in due moderation, of course, and never allow the question of its digestibility to intrude itself, even in an adverse thought. Indulgence in cheerful conversation during and immediately after meals is the best conceivable dietetical and prophylactical receipt of wholesome caution against acute indigestion or chronic dyspepsia. In other words, keep your mind off your stomach during the process of digestion, and you will soon forget that you have a stomach. The immunity of animals and idiots from diseases of the digestive organs, many of whom eat enormously of whatever they can get, is due to the fact that they are beyond the reach of suggestions adverse to health. Someone has well said that if the current dietetic suggestions could reach the mind of an ostrich, he would soon be unable to digest a boiled potato.